Good morning. I'm Bob Inholm, the Executive Director of the President Woodrow Wilson House in Washington, D.C. I'm pleased to join you today. So we've got a high school class. I think, are you both high school classes or middle school? I think.
We're middle school.
Great. Good to know. You'll be pleased to know that I have both been a student in high school and in middle school, and I still remember it. So I'll try to make this interesting and accommodate what I imagine might be your interest. I have two daughters of my own. They're now in their 20s, so they're both out of high school and middle school, but I fondly remember those days. So we're here today to talk about President Woodrow Wilson and the League of Nations. And I'm the director of, as I say, of the President Woodrow Wilson House here in Washington, D.C. I've had this job for about 2.5 years. And so while I don't know everything about President Wilson, I know enough to fake it pretty much, and I'll manage to do that with you today. Let's go to the first slide. Great, this is just sort of an overview. And let me first of all thank my friends at DLA Piper, which is a law firm here in Washington, D.C. I'm using their video conferencing facilities because we at the Woodrow Wilson House, as a little privately funded nonprofit museum, don't actually have a world-class video conferencing facility the way this law firm does. So thank you to DLA Piper. Let's go to the next slide. That's a view of the Woodrow Wilson House from the backyard. This home was built in 1916, and President Wilson and his wife moved into it the very day they left the White House in 1921. And both of them lived there the rest of their lives. Woodrow Wilson himself died in 1924, but Edith Wilson, his widow, lived in the house until 1961, which is pretty amazing. I mean, she lived 37 years after he died, and all that time was a former First Lady and was invited to all the best parties and the inaugurations and whatnot in Washington, D.C. She left the house upon her death to the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and that's who I'm employed by, and they have owned the house now and opened it as a museum to the public for over 50 years. We have over 8,000 artifacts in the house, and the program today is in part about primary source materials, learning about history through primary source materials. And of course, everyone thinks of primary source materials as being documents, and that's certainly true, but primary source materials also include artifacts, and I've accompanied my presentation today with photographs of some of the artifacts that we have in our house. So what I want to accomplish today are three things. I'd like to talk about the nature of the study of history. I enjoyed history in high school, and I hope that you all do or will learn to. I actually majored in history in college and then practiced law for 25 years before becoming a museum director. But I want to talk to you a little about what I find exciting about history. The second thing is we should talk a little about the times of Woodrow Wilson. How his times were different from our times. It was 100 years ago that President Wilson was president, and a lot has changed in that time. And finally, I'd like to focus then on Woodrow Wilson's major accomplishment and his contribution to civil and human rights, which is his proposal of a League of Nations, which basically laid the foundation for our modern United Nations. And I think that's an important contribution I wanted to mention. So those are the 3 points I'd like to make overall, and maybe as we go through this, we'll learn something. So let's go to the next slide. One of the challenges of history is to put yourself back in the time and place of people from another era, from another society, potentially. And that's a significant challenge. It's hard enough to imagine what it would be like today to grow up in another country or in another culture, but it's even more difficult to imagine living in another country or in another culture in another time. And Woodrow Wilson, although he looks modern to us, actually was a Victorian-era gentleman. He grew up in a time when most men had beards and elaborate mustaches. He's the first clean-shaven president basically since Abraham Lincoln was president with a beard. There were only 2 presidents between Woodrow Wilson and Abraham Lincoln, who were clean-shaven, Andrew Johnson and William McKinley. Otherwise, they were all bearded or mustachioed and look of that era because of that. I think Wilson looks more modern to us than he actually was because he's clean-shaven. I tell people if I have only one thing to say about Woodrow Wilson, it would be this, that he imagined the world at peace and then proposed a practical plan to achieve that vision. But his times were very different than our times, and we could do a whole session on Woodrow Wilson's shortcomings, for example. He deserves criticism for his failures regarding issues of race and civil rights. But as a historian at a museum where we have the opportunity to teach what I hope is good history about Woodrow Wilson, if all we remember from that era is that Woodrow Wilson wasn't progressive about issues of race or civil liberties, then we're really not learning history. Because the real question is, what were the views of Americans generally, or what were the views of the world at that time? And again, we could spend a whole session discussing the shortcomings, the failures of America on those issues in that era. Instead, I'd like to focus on the positive contribution that Woodrow Wilson made, and it really is an enduring one, his proposal of a League of Nations. Let's go to the next slide. This takes us back in time. Maybe while I'm talking, you can look, and then I'll tell you which one of these students in 1883 was Woodrow Wilson. It's a picture of the Johns Hopkins University Glee Club, and Woodrow Wilson was a member of the Glee Club and a graduate student, basically, getting his PhD at Johns Hopkins. For those of you from Pennsylvania, from Johnstown, I point out the tragedy of the Johnstown flood was in 1889, as you know. I think it's interesting to relate figures in history to events that we already know. President Wilson was a young faculty member in 1889. He had taught at Bryn Mawr College for a couple of years, ending in 1885, and then he went to Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut, where he taught basically from 1888 to 1890. So during the time of the Johnstown flood, President Wilson was in his early 30s as a professor at Wesleyan University. One of the insights I want to share with you about history is that every famous historic figure was once a child. And I think that's sort of profound. You know, we tend to put people from history into a box, into the box of the time that they're famous for. So we think of Woodrow Wilson as president, and certainly the most important things in his life happened during those 8 years that he was in the White House. But the kind of person he was and the sorts of experiences he had spanned the entirety of his life. And that stretched from the time he was born in 1856, okay, before the Civil War. He was a little boy during the Civil War until his death in 1924. And so you all are probably what? I'm going to say 15, 16, 17 years old probably. What was, well, let me ask you this question. Who do you think was president during Woodrow Wilson's, when Woodrow Wilson was your age? Let me ask the folks in Johnstown if you could think about that. Who was president of the United States when Woodrow Wilson was your age? Who do you think?
Would it be William McKinley?
No, but a good guess because he was in the late 19th century. But I'll just go ahead and tell you, I mean, as you think about this, it was Ulysses S. Grant, okay? A general in the Civil War and then president of the United States for 8 years. He actually was president from the time President Wilson was 13 until President Wilson was 21. Okay? And so, if what you know about Grant, a Civil War general who basically commanded the reconstruction of the South after the Civil War, that was Woodrow Wilson's youth. He was living in Augusta, Georgia during the Civil War. He was actually born in Virginia, and his family moved to Augusta when he was 1 year old. And then he lived in Columbia, South Carolina. So he really was raised in the South, which is an interesting point. And I think it's relevant when we later see Wilson wrestling with whether or not the United States should enter World War I, because he saw the ravages of war as a child. And I think that's something to bear in mind as we study history. And every time you encounter a historic figure, I think it's really interesting to look at someone, they're 70 years old when they did something famous, but subtract 50 years or 55 years and think about what they were doing when they were 15 years old, what the world was like when they were 15. And I just think you can get some amazing historical insights from that. So the person, if we go back to the slide of the Johns Hopkins Glee Club, one slide back, Mike, thanks. The person that's Woodrow Wilson is the guy with the spectacular mustache there in the back row, the second from the right. That's a young Woodrow Wilson. Let's go to the next slide. So the world was very different in Woodrow Wilson's time in many, many important ways. And let's think about some of the social trends that were afoot in Wilson's time. One of them, my dad was an artist, and so I'm always alert to art. And one of them was modern art. I was interested when I came to this room today that there's a modern art painting right behind me. You can see part of it. Modern art, as we know it, did not exist until about 1913 in the United States. There's a famous art exhibition in New York that is credited with bringing modern art to America from Europe. And people were scandalized. This was not representational art. I mean, if you look at the painting behind me, what is that? It's not a person. It's not a boat. Why is it even art? And that question is asked and debated today, but it was vigorously asked and debated in Woodrow Wilson's time. So it's interesting to me that even a concept like modern art was totally new to Woodrow Wilson. The year he was inaugurated was the first year we had a modern art exhibition in the United States. Other social trends to think about are the labor movement, unions, and whatnot were still novel in that era. Immigration. The United States had more immigrants in, let's say, 1914, I think is the year that we had the highest number of people who immigrated to this country or were the sons or daughters of people who immigrated to this country. Basically, a third of Americans were first or second generation immigrants in 1914. That number was never higher before or since. Technology. Thomas Edison and Woodrow Wilson were contemporaries. So all of the inventions that we associate with Thomas Edison, electric lights, the phonograph, electricity, all of that were innovations that were new to Woodrow Wilson as he lived his life. And finally, and importantly, the role of women in society. The 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote as a federal constitutional matter in America, was passed during the Wilson administration. The 1920 election was the first federal election in which women across the country had the right to vote. And frankly, Woodrow Wilson was not that keen on it when he first became president. I mean, it was an interesting thing, but it wasn't something he was particularly in favor of, and his administration famously imprisoned certain suffragists who had chained themselves to the White House gates and whatnot. But it's also the case he was president for 8 years, and during that time he evolved in his thinking, perhaps with the encouragement of his 3 daughters, and he became a supporter of suffrage for women. And one of the words I wanted to call out for you, because it's sort of a strange word, and I'm not sure I knew it when I was in junior high school, probably by high school, so it's time for you to learn it, is suffrage. And generally it means the right to vote, but in the context of this period, it particularly meant the right of women to vote. And so suffragists were people, especially women, who supported the right of women to vote in that era. So that whole era of suffragists and the 19th Amendment was something that was contemporaneous with Woodrow Wilson. Let's go to the next slide. This is the library at the Woodrow Wilson House, where I'm the director, in Washington, D.C. And one of the things I wanted to point out to you is the bust of George Washington that you see there in the middle background. It may not be obvious to you that it is George Washington, but you can take my word for it. It is. And the observation I wanted to make here is that figures in history don't know how things are going to turn out. They're in the middle of a story, and they don't know how the story is going to end. And that's an important thing, too, to remember as you read about history. To us, it's like we're reading this and we already know how it turns out. And in some ways, that can be boring. It's like seeing a movie when your older sister has already told you the ending. It's like, okay, whatever. Let's get to the end. But for the people living history, they don't know how it's going to end. And I think a story about George Washington that's always impressed me illustrates this point very well. We look at George Washington today as one of the founding fathers and our first president, the first of 46 presidents that we've had. But he didn't know that we were going to have 45 more presidents and counting. He didn't know that for sure America was going to work. And in fact, when he was by carriage riding from Mount Vernon, his home, up to Philadelphia, which was then America's capital, to take the oath of office, having been elected for president for the first time, he corresponded with a friend who was, a number of people were suggesting to him that maybe America should just give up and not be a separate country because it's too dangerous out there. The world has all sorts of hazards, and it would be better. Maybe we could be a colony of France if we don't like being a colony of Britain. Or maybe we could, if we went to the British and apologized, maybe they would take us back, and their navy could protect us or whatever. And Washington wrote this letter, and he basically said, we're the first nation on the face of the earth to get to choose the kind of government that we have. The first in human history to do that. And if we should fail at this, we're not only failing for ourselves, but we're failing for all humanity. The next time a group of men and women have the chance to choose their own government, will they choose to have a democratic Republican form of government? Or will they just go back to having a monarchy? Because that's what everyone knows. And because we failed, we'll make it even harder for them to choose to have a democracy. So he understood that he might not succeed and how important it was for him to succeed. And Woodrow Wilson faced a similar dilemma in his time. In 1914, a war broke out in Europe. We call it World War I, but that's, because we know about World War II. In his era, they didn't know there was going to be a World War II, and they called it the Great War because it was a war without precedent. It was a war on a scale no one had ever seen. Think about it. It was the first major war after the Industrial Revolution. So all of the engines of industry, the factories and the new technologies that had come out were turned to the task of destroying cities and killing people. And they were horribly effective at their job. People were stunned, even in the first months of the war, at the casualties. I read the other day, I think in the first 3 or 4 months of the war, France lost 350,000 people were killed. 350,000. And by the time the war was over, French casualties were numbered in the millions. There'd never been a war with such casualties. Tanks, airplanes, submarines, poison gas, machine guns, airplanes. Did I say airplanes? Airplanes again. All were used in this war for the first time. And so when the war broke out in Europe, America's general reaction was, whew, glad that's in Europe and not in America. We'll just leave them to that, and we're not going to be involved. And, if you think about it, America had never been involved in a war in Europe before. I mean, there'd been a little skirmish, the Pirates of Tripoli and all that. I'm aware of that. But a real war, we had not been involved in. And everybody, including Woodrow Wilson, thought we should not get involved in the Great War. Let's go to the next slide. We're about to come upon the centennial, that is the 100th anniversary, of the sinking of the Lusitania, which was a British passenger ship that was sunk by a German submarine on May 7th, 1915. Basically about 1,200 people were killed. About 2/3 of the people on board the ship were killed, and about 128 Americans were among those. And think about this. The Titanic had just sunk about 2 years before. We're still fascinated with the Titanic. You can imagine how fascinated people were in that era. And here's another steamship sunk in a similar way with similar loss of life, except this time, instead of a nameless, faceless iceberg, it was sunk by a German submarine. And it was outrageous. I mean, America had hoped we could stay out of this war. Here's the New York Times with what? 4 headlines. I mean, it was a huge story, as you can see, just from the newspaper. But again, I note about history. We study history in epochs and eras, but history is lived in days and hours. And amazingly, the United States didn't enter World War I right after the sinking of the Lusitania. I mean, it is seen as one of the proximate causes of our entering the war, but it was almost 2 years later before the United States finally entered World War I. And so I think it's an important thing to point out that it's not as simple as the Lusitania was sunk and we immediately went into the war. President Wilson had to wake up every day for almost 2 years and answer the question, why aren't we in this war? Or also half the American people were saying, it looks like you're getting us into this war, you better not. And so it took several other events before we finally entered the war. But even before we entered the war, President Wilson was beginning to think about what this event meant in history. You know, he'd gotten his PhD in history, he was a political science professor, and he was trained to think historically in the broad range about issues that face the world. And here he was facing this war really without precedent. And he was thinking, what will it lead to? What will the world look like after this war? And even in 1916, let's go to the next slide, he gave a speech where he described his vision that perhaps the war would result in a universal association of nations to prevent any war begun either contrary to treaty covenants or without warning and full submission of the causes to the opinion of the world. You remember, in 1914, there was the assassination of the Archduke that basically started the war. There were lots of secret treaties that had people going to war against other countries for no apparent reason from the American perspective. And among the contemporaries, it wasn't obvious why World War I even started. And so President Wilson was thinking, we should have a system where nobody goes to war unless it's a really good reason, and they don't have to prove that reason to the rest of the world. So in 1914, the United States had the largest economy in the world, but a small army. We had 200,000 troops at the beginning of World War I. We were tied with Serbia for the 12th largest army in the world. Now, you may not know Serbia. It's been in the news in more recent years, but it's a country in the Balkans, basically in south-central Europe, a relatively small country. The United States had an army the size of Serbia. By the end of World War I, we had an army of 4 million men in uniform. So from 200,000 to 4 million. And fully 2 million of them were in Europe, which is pretty astounding. That's a remarkable thing. So Wilson was pursuing this idea. He was not alone. There were others in his time who had this idea that maybe there ought to be some sort of arbitration or international system for maintaining peace. But he thought that he thought there was something to this idea. But in the meantime, the United States stayed out of the war, and he offered himself as sort of a mediator, but the European nations didn't take him up on it. Wilson was reelected in 1916, and early in 1917, several things changed. Two of them, importantly, I want to mention. One is the Germans announced that they were going to resume unrestricted submarine warfare. And in addition, there was something called the Zimmermann telegram, which is one of those things that we all learn about in high school and then you file away. But it was an amazing event at the time. Basically, the Germans sent a message by telegram to Mexico saying they were worried the United States would enter the war. And they said to Mexico, if you start a war with the United States on the southeastern border, then after we've won the war, this is Germany talking, after we've won the war, we'll give you Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. Well, when this was intercepted by the British, and they shared it with the Americans, and then it was made public. And the American people were outraged, as you can imagine. And this contributed to a feeling that enough already, we have to enter the war. Let's go to the next slide. And you'll see President Wilson here speaking before Congress. I mentioned earlier women getting the right to vote. You'll notice you don't see a lot of women there in a joint session of Congress. In fact, I dare say you'd probably be hard-pressed to find even one. But there was one. A woman named Janet Rankin from Montana was the first woman and the only woman in this Congress when President Wilson sought a declaration of war. His declaration of war, his speech to Congress on April 2nd, 1917, is considered one of certainly the top 5 and maybe one of the top 3 speeches ever given by an American president. And it's most famous for the line that we need to make the world safe for democracy. But it's more than that, and I invite you to read it. I've given your teachers information, and maybe you've even seen it online already. But the full body of the speech, I think, is important. And I take a longer quote from it that I'll share with you on the next slide, and I'll read. "We shall fight for the things that which we have always carried nearest to our hearts, for democracy, for the right of those who submit to authority to have a voice in their own governments, for the rights and liberties of small nations, for a universal dominion by right of such a concert of free peoples as shall bring peace and safety to all nations and make the world itself at last free." Now let's just pause and relish that great 19th century rhetoric. President Wilson was one of the great speakers of his generation. I mean, it's one of the reasons he was elected president. He was such a great public speaker. And to us, this is a little stilted, a little wordy. Frankly, it's hard to imagine Woodrow Wilson saying anything that fit on a bumper sticker, because he just didn't speak that way. Most of his sentences, I read once a political scientist took all the president's public speeches, all the presidents that we've ever had, and tested like how many words were in each sentence. And Woodrow Wilson was one of the longest. I think his average sentence in a public speech was about 36 words to a sentence. And this is a good one. I even had to put some dots in, I think. But anyway, but the point is, he was appealing to universal principles, not just to what was best for America. And that was sort of an innovation for its time, and one of the things that led him to think about a League of Nations. Let's go to the next slide. We're talking about primary source material, and this is in the Woodrow Wilson House. It's a pen, it's the pen that President Wilson used to sign the Declaration of War in early April 6, 1917. He made the speech before Congress, and then Congress had to declare war. It took them a couple of days to debate it. It was overwhelmingly approved, and they brought the Declaration to President Wilson. Note that it's a fountain pen, or not even a fountain pen, it's a dip pen. I mean, it's a quill pen. It's a pen that you dip in the ink that's there in that bottle. And I also point out that it's in a fancy stand that is actually a carved walrus tusk that was a gift to President Wilson from the Inuit tribes of Alaska. And this, of course, was well before Alaska was a state. Let's go to the next slide. So the war proceeded. The United States was in the war. We got our troops in Europe in the fall of 1917, having declared war in April. And really, with winter, there wasn't a lot the American soldiers could do. But in the spring, the United States soldiers were going to do their first offensive. But that winter, President Wilson made his famous 14-point speech. And this is an important thing for you to learn about Wilson. You know, it's one of the top 3 or 4 things to know about Wilson. 14 points. Everyone knows that. Sometimes later you'll think 12 points, 13 points. No, it was 14 points. And they're important. And basically he was saying, this is what America wants from this war. We'd be willing to end the war if we could have these 14 things. And I invite you to go read his 14-point speech. The things are, some of them are specific, although they can be generalized. But ultimately, he said, and I'll quote here, "What we demand in this war is nothing particular to ourselves." Okay? This is not a war where the United States is in it for something for us. He says we're fighting for principle. What we're fighting for is that the world be made safe for every peace-loving nation which, like our own, wishes to live its own life. You know, undisturbed, really. I mean, like, why is Europe getting us involved in this? Why did they sink the Lusitania and kill Americans? We just wanted to do what we wanted to do. Determine our own institutions. Be assured of justice and fair dealing by other peoples of the world as against force and selfish aggression. All the peoples of the world are, in effect, partners in this interest, and we see very clearly that unless justice be done to others, it will not be done to us. Okay, this is revolutionary for its time. I mean, other people have thought these ideas, but for a president of the United States to get up and say that our foreign policy was not based on might makes right or our own self-interest, but was based on principles that were universal to mankind, was unprecedented. And let's pause for a moment and let me take questions if there are any. But think of examples, if you can, of things that America is doing today where we think it's not really for us. We're not trying to take over that country, but we're trying to assert certain principles that we think as a country, as a people, are right for all mankind. So let me pause for a moment and let you all ask any questions that you have.
Regarding the Organic Act?
I'm sorry, say again?
Do you have any information regarding the Organic Act that you think would be beneficial for our knowledge?
I heard everything but the which act. I couldn't hear the name of the act.
The Organic Act of 1916?
I don't know the Organic Act of 1916. So you've done it. You've stumped the director. Tell me what it did. Maybe I know it, but not by its name.
The Organic Act really tried to help save the national parks and created the National Park Service.
Oh, okay. All right. Great. All right. Yes. So President Theodore Roosevelt is often credited, and I think given a lot of credit, rightly so, for being the first real naturalist and conservationist. And as you may know, he spent some period of time as a young man basically being a rancher in Montana, South Dakota, really living in the West. And so he was among the first to really care about conservation of nature. But actually it was President Wilson, and to be fair, the Congress during his time, who passed the National Park Service Act. And I'll have to look it up, but the Organic Act as well, I guess. Thank you for that. That enshrined in law some of these ideas that we would protect aspects of nature and respect the environment. Remember, Wilson grew up in the late 19th century, and that's the time when, for example, if you've read Charles Dickens' stories in England, capitalism was running amok, and people were living, going to the cities for factory jobs and living in slums, and corporations really were unrestrained in what they did. And the Industrial Revolution came to the United States a few years later, and so it was really the late 19th and early 20th century when you had unrestrained capitalism in the United States. And people woke up to that. In Theodore Roosevelt's time, and certainly by Wilson's time, the progressive movement was in part a reaction to that. And so Wilson, even in his first inaugural address, talks about how we can't just lay waste to the wilderness we've been given. We need to care for it, to be stewards of it, and save it for future generations. So I think there was a beginning of an awareness of what we today would call an environmental awareness, or a sense of stewardship for the resources of the world, that was a borning in that time, and Woodrow Wilson was part of that.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good, I'm glad. My daughters would be pleased that you asked me a question I couldn't answer. I could have made something up, but I figured I wouldn't do that. All right, let's go back to our slides. The Viva Wilson slide. Next slide. Yeah, there we are. Viva Wilson. This is Woodrow Wilson. When Germany finally agreed that they would negotiate a peace on the terms of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, okay, and Wilson, by saying his 14 points, was basically saying to the world, the war doesn't have to end in a fight to the death. We've had millions of people killed. We don't have to have millions more. Why don't we talk this through? And on the basis of principle, let's settle this war, and move on, have peace. And by November of 1918, Germany felt, I think they were realizing they were losing, and they felt, all right, we'll agree now to negotiate a peace on the 14 points. And so Wilson went to Europe to lead the negotiation of the peace accords at the so-called Paris Peace Conference, which resulted in what's called the Versailles Treaty. He was seen as the savior of the world at that time. When he came to Paris, this is an example of the throngs that came out to meet him, hanging signs that said, Viva Wilson, or basically, long live Wilson, in the streets of Paris. It's estimated that 2 million people came to the streets of Paris to greet him when he arrived. And this was because he was going to end this war that was the worst thing humanity had ever seen, as far as most people were concerned. Let's go to the next slide. His 14th point, and that's why I put the Roman numerals, they were Roman numeraled, so you have 14 there, was this: that there should be a general association of nations must be formed under specific covenants for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small nations alike. Okay, you'll notice that some of the language I quoted a few slides back from a speech by Wilson in 1916 uses some of the same words: an association of nations, under covenants, he says. This idea was out there, but here's what's amazing about Wilson. He was really the first figure in history to stake his political career, his place in history, and ultimately, as you'll see, his life, his safety, his health, on the idea of a League of Nations and devoting himself to making it happen. So that's what was discussed at Paris. The various 14 points, the peace negotiations, whole books have been written on it. I won't try to cover it all today. I hear you saying thank you. All right. But I think the 14th point is the single most important, that he was going to establish a League of Nations. Let's go to the next slide. This is a famous picture of the so-called Big Four at Versailles in Paris, basically, at the Paris Peace Conference, planning the Versailles Treaty. These are the leaders of Great Britain, Italy. Note, Italy was our ally in World War I, not in World War II, France, and the United States. Now, there are three terms I wanted to call to your attention, and so let's quickly look at slides that define those. I provided these in advance, but I'm not expecting that you would necessarily have looked at them in advance. But the first is isolationism. And you can read that, but it's basically the idea that my country should be isolated from the political and economic concerns of other countries. And that's basically the view America had before World War I. There are shades of isolationism. Some people think we should just not interact with the world at all. Others think, well, we can trade with the world, but we shouldn't get involved in the world's wars. But the idea is, and it makes sense that, we're America, we should worry about America. And you understand that for a lot of historic and geographical reasons, the United States has had the luxury of being isolationist when countries like Belgium, for example, wouldn't be able to do that. Belgium was invaded by Germany in World War I. It would be very hard for Germany to have invaded America, much harder to have invaded America in World War I, or any war for that matter. So that's one view, isolationism. On the next slide, another view is nationalism. And these are not exclusive. These are just terms, labels that were applied in that era and now to people who held certain views. And nationalism is the view basically of patriotism, of the idea that loyalty to your own country and support of your own country is the guiding principle for your actions. And a lot of people, I would say Woodrow Wilson was a nationalist. It's just his view of what was best for America included the idea of having a League of Nations, where I think other Americans thought that what was best for America was for America not to be part of a League of Nations, and that's a fundamental difference. But that's nationalism. And then the third, I think, is important, is usually called internationalism. And that's certainly something Woodrow Wilson believed, that nations should work together to address common political and economic problems. And again, I want to be fair to Woodrow Wilson's opponents or political antagonists. I think they recognize the value of international cooperation, but at some point, Woodrow Wilson believed, as I say, the United States would be safer, would be more prosperous, and would be able to avoid war as part of an international security arrangement that he called a League of Nations. His political opponents thought the United States would be safer and would be more likely to avoid war if we were able to act on our own without having to worry about other people in an international organization. And frankly, the division between Wilson and his antagonists in 1919, 1920 is a fissure in American politics that exists today. And, we're a nonprofit organization, so I use the terms Democrat and Republican only for their content as telling you who people were to identify people, not so much for their political content. But you see a difference between the Democratic and Republican parties today on that very issue. Is America better off going it alone or joining up with other nations to accomplish what Woodrow Wilson would have said were ultimately our goals? And it's a fair question. I'm not here to I'm here to teach history about President Wilson, not to say he was right in every respect. But I think he had a very good point, and he was the first one to really stake his career and his life on it. The idea that the United States ought to form a League of Nations, the world ought to respect it, and that it would contribute to our moderating the path to war, moderating the impulse to war around the world. So let's go to the next slide. Wilson came back. He spent 6 months. This often surprises people. He spent 6 months in Europe negotiating the Paris Peace Conference. He did come back briefly. I'm the head of the Woodrow Wilson House, so I know that. He did take one quick trip back. It took about 10 days to get across the ocean in a U.S. naval warship in that era. But when he got back, he discovered that he was sort of out of touch with American politics. Time had gone on, and during his absence, basically people were not keen on joining the League of Nations, and the Senate opposed it. And so he basically, this is an era before Twitter, before computers, before television, before radio. Okay, think about that, before radio, even before microphones. Okay, Woodrow Wilson went on a speaking tour across the country to tell the people that they should tell their senators to vote to ratify the League of Nations and the Versailles Treaty. And so he took a 3-week train trip, scheduled 3 weeks, and he went all the way to the Pacific Coast. By the way, for those of you in Idaho, he went to Boise, Idaho. He spoke in Boise, Idaho. One of his main antagonists in the U.S. Senate was the Senator William Borah from Idaho, who's a gigantic figure in the politics of Idaho. I think he was a gigantic figure in Idaho becoming a state and then was an early senator in Idaho's history. But Borah opposed the League of Nations, and Wilson took it right to Idaho to speak about the value of the League of Nations. He went to California, and the picture I'm showing here is actually a picture from Berkeley, which is where I went to school, and that's the Greek theater at the Berkeley campus, where I saw folk singers performing with microphones, and there you see Woodrow Wilson without a microphone performing or speaking before a standing room only crowd in 1919. But here's where Woodrow Wilson's life takes on almost the dimensions of a Greek tragedy. He has taken on this challenge of creating a League of Nations that will limit war and bring peace to the world. And he can't, he doesn't have anyone to delegate this to. He takes it on himself. And in the end, his body is too frail. He can't make it happen alone. He ends up collapsing on this trip, being rushed back to Washington, and having a stroke that ends his effectiveness as president. It leaves him partially paralyzed, and really he never makes a major public speech again. And so he gets it sort of halfway there, but in the end the Senate votes, and there's not just one vote, they vote several times on various versions of the League of Nations and various amendments and whatnot, and the League of Nations is never ratified by the U.S. Senate. The United States never joins. The United States never signs or never ratifies the Versailles Peace Treaty, never joins the peace treaty. And it's really to Wilson's great regret. And it's seen in history as Wilson's great failure. But I would like to invite you to think that it's not only a failure, it's also his great accomplishment. But before we focus on that, let's look at the next word I wanted to call to your attention, which is ratification. And it's a word you may have heard people talk about, and it's used sometimes casually to mean like if you went to a party and your parents didn't know you were going to go, and later you told them and they said it was okay, you could say that they ratified my going to the party. It's something that basically when a step has been taken and then someone else says it's okay, that's ratification. But in our U.S. Constitution, it has a specific meaning, and that is that the Senate, the U.S. Senate, 2/3 of the Senate, not just half, but 2/3 of the Senate is supposed to ratify international treaties before they become valid under the U.S. Constitution. And so Woodrow Wilson had to present the Versailles Treaty to the Senate. It did get a majority of the Senate votes, but it did not get a 2/3 majority. And so it failed for want of ratification. Let me mention also that Woodrow Wilson won the Nobel Peace Prize. He was awarded the prize for 1919 for his efforts in establishing the League of Nations. So the world recognized Wilson's accomplishments, but in politics in America, he wasn't able to get the League of Nations ratified. Let's go to the next slide. So I do think, and here's a picture of the United Nations building you may recognize. This is long after Woodrow Wilson was gone. The United Nations was founded at the end of World War II, and by that time, the United States had changed its mind. And the United States had recognized the wisdom of having something like a League of Nations, and was the prime mover, really, behind the establishment of the League of Nations. Of course, Woodrow Wilson was then 25 years gone, roughly 23 years, deceased. But interestingly, his widow, Edith, was still alive in 1945 when the UN was established. No one went and asked her opinion that I'm aware of, but I can only imagine that she probably said, Woodrow told you so. But I think it is, to be fair, Woodrow Wilson's great contribution to civil and human rights is the recognition of the rights of nations and the rights of people around the world to be represented in democratic countries and to have a UN where each nation has one vote. You'll remember his 14th point talked about nations large and small. In the UN, every nation has a single vote in the United Nations. And in the League of Nations, it's amazing. You look back on it now, it's amazing. Woodrow Wilson gave one seat to Great Britain, the great empire, and another seat to India. Now let's pause and remember, India wasn't a separate country in 1919. India was a colony of Great Britain. You can imagine that Great Britain quite vigorously objected behind the scenes to India getting a seat. And you can imagine as well that India was quite delighted to be able to have a seat at the League of Nations, to be seated at the same table with Great Britain, whose colony they'd been at that point for something over 400 years. And that just shows you the power of Woodrow Wilson's idea, the idea that democratic governments ought to have equal representation. The 20th century is known for many things, but one of them is the dismantling of the colonial empires of that era. And that really began in a way with this idea that Woodrow Wilson and others had, which was that nations should all be equal and should be represented in a global body. So let's go to the last slide. This is a picture of the front of the Woodrow Wilson House. I always like to end a slideshow with a sunset picture. And so this is my sunset at the Woodrow Wilson House. And let me close by saying that Woodrow Wilson made his last speech to the public from our house 5 years after Armistice Day, 3 years after he had left the White House. And it was the last speech he was to make before he died about 3 months later. It was on November 11th, 1923. And it was the first remote radio broadcast to the nation. Several thousand people heard this, more people than had ever heard a human speak before. And Wilson took the occasion to speak once again about what the failure of the United States to join the League of Nations meant to him. And he said that it not only was untrue to the principles upon which America was founded, but it was a betrayal of the sacrifices of our soldiers in World War I. And he told others, and I think he believed, that ultimately a good idea is a good idea and will prevail, notwithstanding the failures of individual advocates. And I think he believed that ultimately the idea of a League of Nations would prevail, and ultimately with the establishment of the United Nations, it did. So that's what I have to say about Woodrow Wilson and the establishment of the League of Nations. And I want to close by inviting you all to come to Washington, D.C., and come visit the Woodrow Wilson House. My email address and phone number are on the slide. So if you should come there, please let me know, and I'd be delighted to give you a tour. And I'm now open for questions. I think we've taken just about 50 minutes, but I'm happy to entertain any questions you might have from either class. Go ahead.
So I've got a quick question. In regards to the Zimmermann Note, was it in order for Mexico to attack the U.S. regardless of whether they entered World War I? Or was it just a precaution where if the U.S. entered, then Mexico would attack from the south?
It's not exactly either of what you say. And by the way, I invite you to look at the Zimmermann telegram online because it's a bunch of 4-digit numbers, each of which corresponds to a word. And what the Germans didn't know was that the British were intercepting these and were able to translate it. They knew the key. But basically, what the Zimmermann was like the foreign secretary of the Imperial German Empire. And he was sending a note to his Mexican ambassador. And he was basically saying to the ambassador, why don't you suggest to Mexico that they create a skirmish or start a war against the United States on the southern boundary. And if they did that, we would basically support Mexico's efforts to take back the territories that they had lost in basically the 19th century to the United States. You remember that Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and even California had been part of Mexico or the Spanish colonies before that. And from the Mexican perspective, these were still arguably places that Mexico aspired to take back. And remember also that Arizona and New Mexico had only become states. They'd been American territories, but they'd only become states in 1913. So maybe it wasn't so ludicrous to think that those areas would be given back to Mexico. But to answer your question directly, the Germans were basically saying, if you start a conflict with the United States on their southwestern border, then we'll reward you for that. And they were thinking to themselves, if they did that, that would deter America from sending an army or as large an army as they might otherwise do to Europe to fight us. Does that answer your question? You might look at the Zimmermann telegram sometime. It's translated. Of course, the code was in English. I mean, it was in German. But then when you translate it into German, then they could translate it into English. But you should go online and look at the Zimmermann telegram to get a flavor for what they were saying at that time.
Yeah. So just to clarify, Mexico attacking the U.S. was not contingent upon the U.S. entering World War I?
No. The idea was, why don't you do that? And then we'll reward you. And it was not contingent.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're certainly welcome. You know, one thing I'll say about history is like life, only it's somebody else's, okay? And as complicated as your lives are, think about, when's the next dance, whose mother's giving who a hard time, whose father's getting a new job, whose family is, relocating. All these things are going on in your own life. And these were going on in the lives of people in that era. Woodrow Wilson's first wife died as First Lady. She was the last First Lady to die in office the very week that Germany invaded Belgium. So he had all this personal stuff going on in his life. At the same time, he was trying to hold America on some course that was not clear to anybody through the tragedy, the growing tragedy that was the beginning of the Great War. So it's just interesting to look at what was going on. It's complicated. And, Germany was trying to figure out what to do. They started with submarines. No one fully understood how effective submarine warfare would be. Remember, Britain had the great navy of the era. And how was Germany to match the British Navy? I think Germany had 21 submarines. And with maintenance and refueling and all this, they only had about 7 of them in the water at any one time. But 7 submarines caused tremendous difficulty for Great Britain and for the world because you never knew where they were going to be, or you knew vaguely where they were going to be, but they could disrupt shipping. And that's what the sinking of the Lusitania proved, was that no one is safe. And that's ultimately what made the United States realize we can't remain isolationist. Ultimately, we've got to get involved in the world, because we want to take part in the world for all the good things it offers. And when a war's going on, we can't remain aloof and remain safe. We have to get involved because we're going to be dragged into it one way or another. Other questions?
So, did Wilson give in to some of the things that the Allies asked in order to get the 14 points passed? And if so, what were they?
The quick answer is yes, except for the what were they. There were lots of things. I mean, literally books, many books have been written about the negotiations of the Versailles Treaty. And, I think it's fair to say modern people look now back on that history and see World War I think properly, as a prelude to World War II. That many of the fundamental issues that existed that caused World War I weren't resolved and ultimately led to World War II, and in fact, in some ways, exacerbated certain problems. But it's also fair to say that the peace that was achieved at Versailles was a more even-handed peace than would have been achieved without Wilson's involvement. Great Britain and France had suffered casualties almost beyond imagining, and were intent on, and I think fairly so, on getting revenge. When President Wilson first got to Paris, the French wanted to take him to see a battlefield. And he said, no, that's fine. And they kept persisting, and he refused. And it wasn't for several months until the treaty negotiations were almost over when he consented to go to a battlefield near Paris. And when he went, I can't quote it exactly, but he said something along these lines: "This is why I didn't want to see this. I don't know that I could have been a fair negotiator if I'd seen this before I entered the treaty negotiations." And of course, from the French's point of view, well, you shouldn't have been a fair negotiator. You should have seen what they did to our country before you entered these negotiations, so you would have sided with us more. But Wilson tried to be even-handed, and so among the things I think you could say he gave up, there are two prominent ones that he gave up that were big controversies at the time. One was called the Shandong controversy, and this involved, if you go back in time, this is the colonial era. China was just in the 19th century really opening up to the West, and many Western powers had established basically franchises in Chinese port cities where they had the exclusive right to trade with China through that port. And Germany had one of those. It was called Shandong, and it had been taken over by the Japanese during World War I. And the question arose, what will happen to Shandong? And the British and the French all had ideas about who the city ought to be given to. And if he were really true to his principles, Woodrow Wilson would have said the city ought to go back to China. National self-determination, democracy, and all that. But Wilson was also a politician, and he wanted countries to join the League of Nations, and he wanted it to be a worldwide organization. And in order to get Japan to join, he basically agreed to give Shandong, the franchise of Shandong, to Japan, and Japan then joined the League of Nations. And China was outraged. It was a huge controversy, and in fact arguably contributed to the founding of the Chinese Communist Party back in 1919. So that's one example. Now, I think Wilson would have said that was the toughest choice he had to make. A close second, though, was a question involving Irish home rule. Ireland, during World War I, was beginning, well, they had previously rebelled, but they rebelled again against the rule of Great Britain. And the Irish came to Wilson and said, we ought to be able to rule our own country. And again, Wilson needed the support of David Lloyd George, who was the Prime Minister of Great Britain, himself Welsh, and at some point basically said, I'm not going to support Irish home rule. I'm going to support Ireland remaining a part of Great Britain as part of this peace conference. And, even though Wilson was himself part Irish, his father was Scots-Irish, and his father's parents had been born in Ireland, but he was Presbyterian, not Catholic. And, to this day, there are people who who are great fans of Ireland who feel that Wilson betrayed Ireland in order to get the League of Nations through. There are other examples, but those are the two principal ones that people point to. But the bottom line is, some will complain that Wilson was too much of an idealist. And as I said before, history, like life, is complicated. I think Wilson was a remarkably ruthless politician and also an idealist. And those two things are the conundrum, the challenge of understanding him and understanding his time. It was a complicated time. He was a complicated man, and that's what makes the study of Woodrow Wilson and his time so rich and so rewarding. And finally, let's think about ways that Wilson's ideas are still around in the world today. After we get off, you might talk in your class about events that are going on in the world I can think of Syria, for example, where, what is the role for America? What is the role for some sort of international organization? And how is all that going to work out? You could also talk about national self-determination. The Kurds, for example, I believe it's fair to say are the largest group of people today who don't have a country of their own, if you want to think about it that way. They're spread across Iran, Iraq, and Turkey, essentially. And as a matter of foreign policy, the United States doesn't support establishing an independent Kurdistan. And in part that's because Turkey would not like to have part of Turkey carved off to form an independent Turkestan or Kurdistan. Wilson was aware of this problem. He wasn't naive, but he believed that whatever the boundaries were, if you established a process for changing boundaries, and that process was the League of Nations, then the boundaries could be changed rationally and reasonably without resort to war to settle political disputes. And so we haven't found that holy grail of the chalice of peace that we can grasp in all circumstances, but we're in many ways still struggling with the same question Woodrow Wilson had, which was, can't we have a peaceful world? And how would we do that? And we're still not sure what the answer is, but we're still searching for that solution. Any other questions? This is great. Thank you.
Hey, yeah, we're gonna stand up.
So.
Yeah, tell me your name. Go ahead.
I'm Emma.
Hi, Emma.
Hi. So, if Wilson hadn't accepted things from the Allies, so his 14 points had been passed, then do you think that Germany wouldn't have been blamed as much for the war, and then it wouldn't have led to World War II?
I think Wilson's 14 points came late in the process. Germany was being vilified in Europe, really as soon as Germany invaded Belgium. I mean, Germans were considered to be committing what were called atrocities in the time, and Germans can, say maybe not, maybe so, whatever. But I think by 1914, the die had been cast that bad things were happening in World War I. And so I think Wilson tried to, the casualties, even in that first year, by the end of 1914, were in the millions. And so even at the early outset, the war was a horrible, horrible thing. And Germany, because it was more of a militaristically organized country, because it was basically run by the Hohenzollerns and the Prussians, which had such a military caste and prided themselves on their military prowess and saw this as their, sort of leading the vanguard of German militarism, I think they were going to get blamed. Now, Germany was blamed by the British and the French, and there was lots of propaganda that went on back and forth. But there were several events. The betraying of Belgian neutrality. There was a nun in Belgium, Clavel was her name, or Clavel, who was executed by the Germans early on, a British nun, for basically helping the British. She was executed in a firing squad. This is just foolish to do. And even the sinking of the Lusitania, again, books have been written about what happened, but ultimately Germany decided they were going to show people, but they didn't fully understand how it would be received, not only in America, but around the world, as just a ruthless and unauthorized, undeserved breach of what were the expected norms in that time. So I think Wilson's 14 points established a baseline. They were traded against, and the ultimate Versailles Treaty was tougher than Wilson would have liked. But even on the ship over to the Paris Peace Conference, he said to one of his aides, I'm really popular now, but when this is over, no one is going to like me because I can't give any of them, much less all of them, what they want. And that was the difficulty of the Paris Peace Conference. Follow up or other questions?
We got more.
I
Okay, I'm good. I'm here, by the way. I don't want to keep you. We're past now. We've had an hour, so I don't want you to think I'm keeping you, but I'm happy to stay. This is great.
Oh,
Thank
they're
you.
happy to stay. They're fine.
Yeah, we're good. We're good.
All right.
So do you think that the United States and Britain almost deserved the sinking of the Lusitania, because the Britain did the whole blockade to try to starve out Germany, and if that wasn't viewed as negatively as the U-boat sinking the Lusitania, then why was that fair?
Right. I don't think deserved is the right word. And again, I often resort to the complexity of history. It's certainly the case that, what happens is the Lusitania sunk, and it comes to us as like a bumper sticker. Like, Lusitania sunk, America enters the war, and that's what we learn. But thankfully, we study history. And so when you get into a history class like the one you're in, you're asking exactly the right question. It's a lot more complicated than that. And people had their sides, you see. And so for the people who wanted America to get into the war, okay, Theodore Roosevelt, for example, thought we should be in the war as soon as the war started. He basically questioned Woodrow Wilson's patriotism, his intelligence, his manhood, everything, when Wilson wouldn't enter the war right away. Meanwhile, someone like, if you know William Jennings Bryan, who was a giant political figure of the late 19th and early 20th century, who was the Democratic nominee for president 3 different times, was Woodrow Wilson's Secretary of State. And he was a pacifist, and he thought America should do everything to stay out of the war. And he was the Secretary of State. So he thought that Americans should be told not to sail on British vessels. Britain and Germany are at war, and if Americans are on a British vessel and it gets sunk by the Germans, they shouldn't have been there. And Wilson thought, no, we ought to be able to have a neutrality that allows Americans to sail. There ought to be continuing international commerce. And so when the Lusitania was sunk, to Bryan, it proved that we should have told Americans not to sail on British ships. And to Roosevelt, it proved, well, you see, the Germans really are horrible, and we need to go over there and teach them a lesson, and I'm just the guy to do it. And yet, as I told you, Wilson didn't enter the war. He didn't seek a declaration of war for 2 more years. So the sinking of the Lusitania didn't resolve the issue for him. It was still complicated. And by the way, William Jennings Bryan resigned as Secretary of State because he thought that Wilson's letter to Germany was too strongly worded and might provoke the Germans into declaring war against the United States. So Wilson was walking a razor's edge trying to keep the United States out of the war. And remember, we'd never been in a war in Europe. It was without precedent. It's hard to imagine that in 1914, it's impossible to imagine that in 1914 or even 1915, one last thing. After the sinking of the Lusitania, they didn't have public opinion polls in those days, but John Cooper is one of the great Wilson biographers, tells this story that the New York Times, or maybe it was one of the other New York papers, but a New York paper of prominence, it may have been the Times, did a poll after the sinking of the Lusitania. And they asked newspaper editors around the country, and they asked like 1,000 of them. So this is a pretty good polling sample. 1,000 of them, should the United States go into the war? And do you know how many answered yes? 6. That's like S-I-X. 6 out of 1,000. So that's some measure of where America was in thinking about this. We just weren't prepared emotionally or practically to enter World War I in 1914 or even in 1915. But 2 years later, Wilson had been undertaking in 1916 what he called his preparedness campaign to gear up our industrial production, to brace us for potentially having to enter the war. And he'd been giving speeches, as had others, about what it might mean if we did enter the war. And then when Germany took the gloves off again, after the Lusitania, they said, all right, we're going to not sink neutral shipping. We'll give them warnings and things like that. And they did that a bit. But in 1917, they once again said, we're going to unrestricted submarine warfare. And that was when Wilson really decided it was time to get in the war. Okay?
Can I ask?
Other questions? Yes. Really?
So
You look familiar.
I'm back. So the British blockade was illegal, though, and the U-boats weren't illegal until the Sussex Pledge. So why was it okay for the U-boats to be made illegal, but the British blockade was illegal in the first place and still wasn't stopped by America.
Yeah. I mean, obviously you've been doing some reading, and that's a great thing. So, so you're exactly right. And sometimes, I was a lawyer for 25 years, and there are lots of lawyer jokes where the punchline is something along the lines of, so what do you want the answer to be? It's sort of how the lawyer thinks about the problem. And in warfare, in history, often the right answer depends upon where you sit. And so among Wilson's 14 points, one of them, I forget right now which one exactly, I think it's the 10th, but one of them was that there should be freedom of the seas. Okay? Great Britain vigorously resisted that idea. Their view was, wait a minute, there's no freedom of the seas. We have the biggest navy in the world, and we control the seas, and that's just fine with us. But from the United States perspective, Wilson wanted us to be able to continue to trade with both sides in the war without our shipping being interfered by belligerents. And so, what were the rules of international law at that time? They were only beginning to be formed. And it's fair to say that the Germans broke certain international rules, the so-called cruiser rules, when they sunk the Lusitania. It's also fair to say that the British were breaking the rules by blockading Germany and Europe and trying to keep goods out of German ports. And go back to 1914. It wasn't obvious, it is in retrospect, but it wasn't necessarily obvious that if the United States entered the war, that we would enter the war on the side of Great Britain. The largest immigrant group in America in 1914 were Germans. And from their perspective, this is a substantial number of Americans, from their perspective, we should get into the war on the side of the Central Powers, Germany. And frankly, had we, they might have won. But when you look back on it, I think culturally and politically and economically, America and Great Britain were so much in harmony that it was hard to imagine that ultimately we would enter the war on any side other than that of Great Britain. And Wilson himself was such an Anglophile. He was a great supporter. He was a great student of Gladstone and whatnot. So anyway, to answer your question directly, it could have been that we took the position that Great Britain was violating international law. But I think ultimately bigger forces were at play, and we didn't decide what to do based on a legalistic view of individual aspects of international law, but more based on a sense of, from a matter of principle, what was right. And remember, World War I was seen in some circles as a war between the democracies and the empires. And particularly after the first Russian Revolution, Russia being on the side of the democracies, but weirdly having a czar until after the revolution, when they appeared like they were on their way to a democracy, it made it a lot easier for the United States to step in on the side of the democracies against the empires. I think that was more important than any analysis of any particular legal issue. Okay, other questions? Any more from Emma? Go ahead, sir.
What do you think would have happened if Wilson hadn't been inaugurated?
Okay. It brings up one of the great fun things about history. And if you hadn't heard this term yet, I'll share it with you now. It's called a counterfactual. Like what would have happened if what really happened didn't happen? And one way to answer them is to say, who knows? There's no way to talk about a counterfactual. But it is very interesting. The 1912 election was one of the most remarkable in American history. There were actually 4 credible candidates, although I guess you could say that one probably wasn't as credible as the other 3, and that was the socialist candidate, Eugene Debs. But, 4 candidates, and Eugene Debs got 6% of the vote. We have third-party candidates who are considered potent who don't get 6% of the vote. He was a fourth-party candidate, for goodness sakes. That Wilson was running against William Howard Taft, who was the incumbent president, and also that was the election when, you'll remember, Theodore Roosevelt broke from his Republican Party, established the Bull Moose Party, and ran as well. So it was Wilson basically was elected in a landslide in the electoral college, but he only got 43% of the popular vote. So again, books have been written on this aspect of Wilson's history, whether he might have been elected if Theodore Roosevelt had not broken the Republican Party, or if the Republicans had coalesced behind Roosevelt. It's 6 of one, half dozen of the other. There is a good case to be made that Wilson, running against Roosevelt alone, could still have won the Electoral College vote in 1912. So what would have happened? I mean, the progressive era was something that swept America and swept both parties in its flood. So Theodore Roosevelt was a progressive Republican. Woodrow Wilson was a progressive Democrat. And so I think a lot of the progressive era reforms that are associated with Wilson might have occurred in any event. But let's give Wilson credit for being Woodrow Wilson. He brought an all-new approach to being president of the United States. He arrived with a legislative agenda. He inaugurated the idea of having the State of the Union address delivered in person, a principle that had been discontinued by Thomas Jefferson, as you probably know. So he gave the State of the Union address in person and with a purpose. And he showed up and had, I think it's fair to say, the most successful domestic policy achievements of any president up to that time in history was Woodrow Wilson's first term. He got the Federal Reserve Act passed. We talked earlier about the National Park Service and the Organic Act, which I'll have to look up, in 1916. But the Clayton Antitrust Act, the Federal Trade Commission, the first lowering of the tariff since before the Civil War, a bunch of things that were on Wilson's progressive agenda to accomplish, he got accomplished. And so I do think he made a difference. But I think in the broad sweep of history, many of these things were going to happen sooner or later. Child labor laws were one of Wilson's legislative accomplishments. But then, amazing to me, they were struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court as being an unconstitutional interference of the right of contract. And it wasn't until the 1920s that the Supreme Court acknowledged the right of the federal government to make laws about child labor. So, so some of these things were just part of the tide of history, but I think Woodrow Wilson put his special mark on them. Okay? Other questions? I'll take one more. Okay.
Yeah, we got one more really good one.
How do you think do you think the U.S. missed its opportunity to create peace in the Middle East by not joining the League of Nations and assisting Britain and France in the dividing of the Middle Eastern nations?
Yeah, okay. Very good question. I mean, and this is one of the great questions and really one of the great counterfactuals about Woodrow Wilson. I've heard it said that, if only Woodrow Wilson had compromised and gotten a couple more votes for the Versailles Treaty in the Senate. It failed, by the way, by 7 votes. If only he had compromised, then the U.S. would have joined the League of Nations. And since we were at the table, the League of Nations would have had more teeth, and we would have prevented World War II, and it's all Woodrow Wilson's fault. And while we're at it, I often add, why don't we blame him for thermonuclear war and the Holocaust as well? It's impossible to know what would have happened. There was a tremendous isolationist backlash after the United States' involvement in World War I. Even though our entry in the war is now seen, I think was seen at the time, as being decisive in allowing the Allied powers to win, it was still, we lost 117,000 Americans. It was still a horrible thing for the United States to be involved in that war. And the question burned in everyone's mind, why are we even there? And so when the 1920 election came, Wilson, as you know, had a stroke in office and wasn't nominated by his party. In theory, he could have been, but there was a practice of presidents limiting themselves to 2 terms, but whatever. James Cox was elected by the Democrats, with Franklin Roosevelt, by the way, as the vice presidential candidate. But it was Warren Harding, with Calvin Coolidge as his vice president, who were elected. And Warren Harding's campaign slogan was, a return to normalcy. And Woodrow Wilson basically took that personally. It was like, what? I'm not normal? But there was this sense that America felt like, let's get back within ourselves. Let's come back. Let's not get involved in wars in Europe. And so I think that given the urgency of Britain and France's concerns in the Middle East and in Eastern and Central Europe and in Europe in general, given the fact that they were colonial powers with literally centuries of experience, that it's not likely that the United States would have been able to hold sway over them and, as a neutral arbiter, somehow have created a more peaceful situation. I think what Woodrow Wilson hoped was that his idea of a League of Nations would have created a process that would help solve the problem, would create peace for the future. When I was a corporate lawyer, basically I was a professional negotiator, and I saw that there are many kinds of problems in humanity. As a lawyer, you see all sorts of things. But there are a number of different ways to solve those problems, and some problems need to be solved in detail. Like, on Tuesday, somebody needs to give somebody else $10,000. That's the solution. But other problems need to be solved in principle. You need to agree that in these sorts of situations, you're going to go to arbitration or whatever. And I think Wilson saw enduring peace as a problem that should be solved in principle. And the principle was a League of Nations. The principle was no secret treaties. A principle was if you wanted to go to war, you shouldn't do it for selfish reasons of territorial aggrandizement. You should have to plead your case to the world and say, it's not right. These people who speak our native language are being subjugated by our neighbor, and they're in that neighboring country, and really the boundary ought to be drawn so that those people are now part of our country. And let the world debate it, and then the world can reach a reasonable conclusion and enforce it, maybe not even by war, but with the strength of its rightness. The strength of the fact that the opinion of the world is on one side or another, and who's going to go to war against that. And that's where, I think Wilson, as a political scientist, thought that if you're facing the whole array of the world and its opinion and its willingness to go to war against you, if you should contradict the judgment of the world, that who even the Prussians even wouldn't go to war in the face of that sort of opposition, and that might secure peace. I don't think he was naive about peace. I think he thought that a League of Nations really would secure, or at least limit the number of circumstances in which people went to war. So I think he would have said that in the Middle East, if the boundaries were drawn wrong and we have a functioning League of Nations, then the tribes or peoples of the Middle East can take their case to the League of Nations. And it didn't work, not only because the United States didn't join it, but because people weren't prepared to entrust a global deliberative body with ultimate decision-making over certain things. And hey, does that sound familiar today? I mean, people aren't willing to trust the UN with that sort of decision-making either. And I think it's that dilemma that we face as humanity. Are we willing to let a global body actually have authority? Or do we want it to be just a debating society? And Woodrow Wilson would have said, it can't just debate. At some level, and this is what Article 10 of the League of Nations Treaty was all about, at some point, we're in it. It's a mutual security arrangement, and if everybody else says they're going to war, we have to be willing to go to war too. It's just that Wilson believed if that were true, then no one would take everyone on at once, and so we wouldn't have a war. That was his hope. Okay? Great questions. Somebody's teaching you history. That's a good thing. So I'll leave you with this. I think history is relevant to modern times. To our daily lives, certainly to the politics that we read in the papers every day. And I certainly see this. I'll just share with you, my daughters think that I find Woodrow Wilson too often in everyday events, but I don't think I'm wrong. I think I see him lurking in everything that we do. And it was 100 years ago when he came up with some of these ideas. But 100 years, I'm in my early 60s now. I can tell you 100 years is just not that long a time. For history, it's really the blink of an eye. So Woodrow Wilson is very much with us. And some of the ideas that he first brought up are ideas that we're still debating. Some of the questions that he and his political antagonists debated are questions that have been poured maybe into different wine bottles, but we're still drinking the same wine and wondering the same questions. And I think that's why it's rewarding and even important that we study Woodrow Wilson. So I've given you my email address. If you don't have it, I'm sure someone can get it for you. I'd be happy to answer questions, including trivia questions on Woodrow Wilson. I have an almost limitless knowledge after 2.5 years in this job. But don't ask me about the Organic Act until tomorrow. All right, y'all. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hey, bye-bye.